What would you do if you failed at a task 6 times? Would you try again? Would you give up? Perhaps you would only go for a 7th attempt if the reward was worth your time. Determination is a powerful tool that can take anyone far in life. The will to never give up. The pull of obsession. Michael Rheinberger embodied every aspect of what determination is. At the age of 53, he had 6 unsuccessful summit attempts on Everest. But that didn't matter, because during the spring season of 1994, Michael was ready for his 7th attempt, chasing that ever-eluding goal before Father Time says no more. Mike's tale is one of inspiration, and of course, tragedy. This is his story. Australian Michael Rheinberger would arrive at Everest in early March of 1994, where he would join a large American expedition of over 40 individuals. Now Michael was very familiar with the mountain, so more or less he acted as his own guide, meaning he would participate in the American expedition by helping move gear, but for the most part was left on his own accord. For Michael, this was perfect. It allowed him to take advantage of certain aspects the expedition would leave behind, like their fixed ropes and gear. But this would not be an easy task for the large group of climbers either. They were setting up the north route, although on certain days nothing could get done as the weather proved to be insurmountable. Other days they were able to make small progress. And by the end of March, Rheinberger Base Camp was fully operational, as well as Camps 1, 2, and 3 on Everest. Their progress did not stop there. On April 2nd, Camp 4 would be successfully pitched at 7,010 meters. Or 23,000 feet. The following days in April proved to be freezing with powerful gusts of wind. The ability to carry heavy equipment up and down the mountain was greatly hindered, and there would be multiple days through April that leaders in the expedition would attempt to establish Camp 5, but all were unsuccessful. The camp's location would be at 7,802 meters, but the clouds and winds made visibility hard to see. Luckily, the team had set up a fixed line along the northern ridge that allowed them to traverse a technically difficult climb. Tired and covered in snow, they finally secured Camp 5. However, the winds would tear down their work overnight. The men were frustrated, but did not let that deter them as they simply secured the tents again. But just when members of the expedition began to relax, a Sherpa had an unexpected stroke at Camp 4. Everything was put on hold as people leapt into action trying to help. The closest medical facility was in Kathmandu, over 12 miles away, so members of the expedition resorted to carrying the Sherpa down the mountain. Along the way, he would experience over 7 grand mal seizures while being carried. It would take the next 36 hours and the efforts of over 20 individuals, but they managed to get the Sherpa to proper help. Over the course of the whole ordeal, they had to administer 10,000 liters of oxygen, 10 liters of IV fluid, and anticonvulsive drugs. But I'm happy to say that the man did make a full recovery a month later. The incident caused a delay of about 10 days in all mountaineering tasks, and the expedition would need to prepare again for a summit push. Towards the end of May, the weather was calm, which created a perfect opportunity, and Michael would not let this chance pass him by. On May 26, Michael, along with fellow climbers Mark Wetu and David Staheli, were all positioned at Camp 6. Perfect location for their own summit push. The weather could not have been more perfect either. The trio agreed that they would climb together and would start their climb early in the morning. There really was nothing obscuring their vision from below, so base camp kept tabs on where the group was fairly easy. But as the day went on, you could see some signs that worried those watching. You see, Mark was a strong climber that had summited Everest 3 years earlier in 1991 by climbing the same route that they currently were on. So it's not like he was unfamiliar with those exact conditions. David was no stranger either. Being a well-known Alaskan climbing guide, he was a very strong climber in his own right. But it was obvious that 53-year-old Michael was slowing the group down badly. Their movement was very behind schedule, and it was clear from the spectators below that they would not have enough time to safely summit. They watched as the trio passed the first step. Michael, Mark, and Dave took a short break here to reassess themselves and the climb. It was obvious to a climber with experience like the three had that the smart move would be to turn around. But for some reason, Michael was very against this and wanted to keep going regardless of their pace. It was clear to David that Michael was letting his past experiences affect his decision-making, which would not be safe in any circumstance. But it was already noon, and they still had a lot of progress to go if they wanted to make the summit, not even considering the return trip. Overall, David did not think that the summit attempt would be feasibly safe to continue, so he decided to turn back before traversing the second step. Michael and Mark understood the risk that they were taking, but still decided to continue their summit push nevertheless. They watched from below as the duo marched slowly towards the summit, racing the sun. I almost wish I could pinpoint a reason for their slowness, such as the weather, but that just isn't the case. Many reports have claimed that there was not a better day for the summit attempt, so I have to attribute the main reason for their slowness was simply, well, Michael. Someone from the expedition was keeping constant tabs on the duo and their location. However, as the sun began to set, it became more difficult to visibly see them against the mountain. They were truly on their own. This wouldn't be a story about determination without successfully completing one's goal, and at 7:20 p.m., Michael would summit Everest. Finally, after 6 failed attempts. I can't even imagine how he must have felt, the sheer feeling of accomplishment. But like the sun, that feeling would disappear and be replaced with the realization of their situation. Exhausted and spent, the duo quite literally made camp on the summit for the night. They created an open bivouac, which means they had no tent, but probably found or dug an area that had some type of natural cover. The duo would be exposed to the sky, so they certainly were relying on the weather remaining calm, as any type of downfall would mean certain death at this point. It's rather obvious, but I will mention that they were well in the death zone, meaning their bodies were literally deteriorating the longer they remained above 8,000 meters. Add in the fact that Michael was relatively old for mountaineering, and it is safe to assume, based on the summit push, he was not in the best health. When the sun rose the next morning, they knew something was wrong. The weather was much colder and windier than the day before. This would also be noticed by members of the expedition from below. Luckily, there was a team ready to summit, waiting at Camp 6, so they were sent early in the morning to try and assist the duo. Michael and Mark began their descent early as well, but it was clear to Mark that Michael was having a very rough time. After even just a little progress, the duo had to stop to accommodate Michael and his health. But despite their continued slow pace, Michael's condition deteriorated more and more. He became snowblind early on in the day from the constant exposure to the sun and snow, which ultimately meant more delays. The longer the pair was in the death zone, the more effect it was having on each other and their bodies. As a few hours went by and the sun was well up in the sky, Michael's legs faltered. They would no longer support the weight of his body. Mark knew that help was on the way, but they would not be close enough for them to survive long. Mark began carrying him down the mountain, as the only other option was to abandon Michael. It might seem like a simple decision at first to help your fellow climber, but understand that Mark was under the same conditions, and his body was not taking kindly to the death zone either. It was clear that he was becoming fatigued as well, and he knew the longer he stayed in the altitude, the higher his chance of death. Despite all this, they spent 11 hours descending through the day. The duo would only cover a measly 900 feet before darkness overtook them. Mark did not know this at the time, but the rescue team would not be climbing up to meet them. They had to stop their climb due to the windy conditions and never made it past the first step. At the time of sunset, Mark had carried Michael to just under the second step, and despite his determination to help his fellow climber, he could not carry him any further. Mark had developed frostbite on his toes, which if not treated, would be his own death sentence, as he would not be able to climb. Additionally, he just didn't have enough energy left to continue carrying Michael down the mountain. Finally, a point had been reached where a decision had to be made. Leave Michael to die and try to survive yourself, or stay with Michael and try to survive another night together. All variables had to be considered, and given the condition of Michael, Mark decided that he would continue the climb alone. Mark managed to communicate his plans down to base camp, which they then relayed the plans to Camp 6. Jason Edwards, a fellow climber from the expedition, managed to climb up to the first step and reach Mark, and from that point on, he would continue to assist him until they managed to reach Camp 6. The next day, Mark would make it back to base camp with the help of his peers, but not without being exhausted. By the end of the trip, he was limping and utterly spent. Advanced frostbite had developed to cover his feet, but Mark would make a full recovery. Michael, on the other hand, tragically died on Everest just under the second step. Some may look at this story and think Michael was foolish, but it's really hard to say after covering so many mountaineering tragedies. There's a certain aurora that these mountains create, and a few individuals fall in love with them. Michael was simply just one of those people, just a simple man with an obsession that caused him to be so determined he looked the other way in the face of danger. I certainly have to admire that.